October 1958, East Texas. A black widow stood in her own front yard and watched strangers park their trucks on the ranch her late husband had spent 12 years building in less than 10 minutes. Everything she owned would belong to someone else. But before the auction ended, a quiet stranger beside the road would raise one hand and change her family's future forever. If stories about ordinary people receiving extraordinary acts of kindness still mean something to you, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from in the comments, because every week we bring you stories of courage, justice, and the kind of moments that remind us why humanity still matters. Sarah Whitaker was 48 years old and wore a faded navy dress and a brown coat too thin for the season. Her husband, Elijah, had bought the 160-acre Texas ranch in 1946 after returning from war and spent years clearing mesquite, repairing fences, and building a life that many believed a black family could never achieve in that part of Texas. Then, in June of 1958, Elijah ran into a storm to close a gate left open by frightened horses, and lightning struck the cottonwood tree beside the corral. He never came home. Sarah buried him on Wednesday, received the bank's first letter on Friday, and by October, the foreclosure auction had arrived on her front lawn. The cattle had already been sold, the horses were gone, and only the ranch remained. Men from across the county stood with their hats in their hands, avoiding each other's eyes because nobody wanted to bid against a widow. Then a large cattle buyer from Dallas named Vernon Pike raised one finger and offered $4,000. The debt on the ranch was nearly $7,000. $4,000 meant the bank would recover part of its money and Sarah would walk away with nothing. The auctioneer hesitated. $4,000 once, $4,000 twice. Sarah stood silently beside a wooden box containing Elijah's watch, his army photographs, and the original deed to the ranch. Then a calm voice came from the road. $8,000? Every head turned. A man in a tan hat and brown jacket leaned against an old pickup truck beneath an oak tree. Nobody had seen him arrive. Vernon quickly bid $9,000. $10,000, the stranger answered. $11,000. Vernon snapped. $12,000, the stranger replied without raising his voice. The crowd began whispering. Nobody knew who he was. Vernon looked at the banker for support, but the man only stared back. $12,000 was real money, more than the ranch was worth on paper. Finally, Vernon removed his hat. "That's enough for me." The auctioneer raised the gavel. "Sold." The stranger walked calmly toward the front of the crowd while people stepped aside to let him pass. He removed a thick leather wallet from his coat and counted $12,000 in $100 bills onto the tailgate of the auction truck. The banker counted it once. Then again the debt was covered, the fees were covered, and money still remained. "Whatever's left belongs to Mrs. Whitaker," the stranger said. Then he turned to the auctioneer. "You've got the deed?" "Yes, sir, you draw it up." The auctioneer filled out the paperwork, then stopped when he reached the line for the buyer's name. "Who do I put here?" The stranger looked across the yard at Sarah, who still seemed unable to understand what had happened. "Sarah Whitaker," he said. The auctioneer looked up in confusion. "Sir, you bought the ranch." The stranger nodded. "I know, put her name on it." Silence fell over the entire yard. Sarah finally found her voice. "I don't understand." The man walked over to her. Up close, his face looked weathered and tired. The face of someone who had spent years seeing more than he ever talked about. "Your husband served?" he asked. Sarah nodded. Korea. The stranger looked toward the pasture and then back at her. He paid for this place already. Men like your husband built more than fences and barns. They built this country. This isn't charity, it's overdue payment. Tears filled Sarah's eyes. I can never repay you. The stranger smiled gently. I didn't ask you to. She held the deed in both hands as though it might disappear. What's your name? She asked softly. I'd like to tell my family. The man looked toward his truck. Tell them somebody stopped by the auction. He turned and began walking away. Then an old rancher near the cattle pen suddenly pointed toward him. Good Lord. That's Jared. The stranger never turned around. He simply lifted one hand, the same easy hand that had raised the bid, and climbed into his pickup truck. Dust followed him down the county road until he disappeared from sight. Sarah stood in her yard holding the deed to her ranch and cried quietly while the crowd watched. She kept the ranch the following spring. Neighbors helped her bring in cattle. 3 years later she repaired the barn. 5 years later she drilled a new well. She never borrowed from a bank again and never mortgaged the land. Her grandchildren would one day ride horses across the same pasture where strangers had once gathered for the auction inside the farmhouse. Beside the kitchen window, a framed deed still hung on the wall. October 1958, 160 acres conveyed to Sarah Whitaker. At the bottom was a single handwritten line. Purchased and conveyed on the same day by request of the buyer. The buyer's name appeared nowhere on the paper because he refused to let it be written, but the county never forgot. Because on one cold morning in Texas, a black widow lost her ranch at auction, and a quiet stranger named Jared raised one hand and gave it back.